What is DanDaDan, and how did it manage to somehow take over my entire life? DanDaDan is the most insane, bizarre, and honestly fascinating manga I've ever read in my entire life. And it's not really a surprise either, considering the mangaka Yukinobu Tatsu worked on one of the most other wild manga I've ever read in my life, Chainsaw Man. And while just going through Kinokuniya searching for my next manga to pick up, I decided screw it, I'll just try out this random manga that I've been hearing a lot about on the internet. But oh my god, I didn't think I was going to love it this much. I told myself only one chapter, read just one chapter. I read the entire thing in one sitting, and then I ordered the rest of the available manga on Amazon that night. I love it that much. This manga goes by quick, with story arcs and beats going everywhere within just an individual chapter, but I'll be here to break it down arc by arc, beginning with the one that started it all, the Turbo Granny arc. My name is Josue, welcome to the Panda Brothers channel, and let's talk some DanDaDan. It's weird to define DanDaDan. At times it feels like a regular shonen jump story. Some aspects of this series we've seen a million times in other manga. Like, you want transformations? Well, DanDaDan has that in the first chapter alone. You want the oblivious yet well-meaning protagonist? Well, DanDaDan has two of them. There's an interesting spin here, however, as Tatsu opted to combine the usual flavor of Shonen Jump with a high level of obscene humor and horror. I'm not kidding either, this is not a manga to really read at nighttime. Like, yeah, 70% of the manga is really well-meaning, very funny, just a regular Shonen Jump story, but that 30%? I was actually kind of scared at times. I'm not going to lie, I was kind of like in the dark reading it, and I'm like, let me put on the light. One of the primary reasons why it even gets as scary as it does is because of its incredibly high detailed artwork, especially for when its scary elements get introduced. It's pretty clear from the very beginning that the art in DanDaDan is just phenomenal. It's honestly absurd how good this manga's art is. At first, I had an issue with how simply designed Momo and Okarun were. Well, especially Momo, as she looks strikingly similar to a character named Era, who gets introduced a little bit later in the series. You know, same face, just different hair color. I was nervous we might run into a One Piece situation where every woman is basically either some variation of the beautiful Nami or a completely ugly monster-looking creature. But that is definitely not the case here, so props to Tatsu for the incredible attention to detail and really making you feel incredibly scared at times. Now, at the time of recording, I have every single available manga that's out in the United States right now. Now, the original plan was to just read it arc by arc and then create a video on it before I continue on to the next arc, but I couldn't do that. I had no patience. I just had to keep reading. DanDaDan had me so bad. I'm only caught up with the physical releases though, not whatever the recent chapter is. I'm just going to read it as it comes out physically. I just can't do that to myself. I just want the entire series. Physical. There's roughly 4 arcs now physically available at the time of recording, so let's go through these god tier 4 arcs, baby. Let's get into it. Now, we can't talk DanDaDan without first talking about our protagonists and main characters. They're quite literally half the reason why this manga goes as hard as it does. The aforementioned Momo Ayase is oddly enough one of my favorite protagonists in a manga in a very long time. And there isn't really much to hate about her. I don't remember the last shonen that featured a female protagonist, but nothing about her ends up feeling very tropey. She has a unique power system, unique relationships with everyone in the manga, and her relationship with both Okarun and her grandmother are just full of nuance and gravitas to a point that it makes both relationships feel kind of real, if that makes sense. Like, it just feels like a relationship that I can imagine happening in real life. Nothing weird, nothing fake about that. Just, this is how people would interact with each other. I didn't think much of Okarun when he was first introduced. I usually hate characters like him, but he really grows on you when you eventually realize that he isn't really a bitch at all when he's eventually pushed to his limits. Seiko Ayase fills in the usual shonen role of that older, more powerful mentor-ish role in the series, except she flips it on its head as well. She's like a great combination of both Master Roshi from Dragon Ball Z, mixed with Genkai from Yu Yu Hakusho. And the last major character to mention in this first introductory arc is the one and only Turbo Granny. But let's save her for a bit later as we start to break down the arc that's named after her. April 6th, 2021, the day it all started. The day we were introduced to a Momo kicking her boyfriend's ass because she didn't want to put out for him. And honestly, good for her. She stood her ground, she didn't want to do something that she did not want to do. Good for her for kicking his ass. Screw that dude. Like, dude, talk about an introduction. I'm only a couple pages in and I'm already liking our main protagonist. Momo has a group of friends who I honestly don't know what their names are. I didn't even write it down. I just thought that their character design is so weird. Like, look at her. What is what is this? We also learned that Momo has an obsession for the late Japanese actor Ken Takakura. This obsession was pretty much the only reason why she even dated that guy at the beginning. He looked just like Ken Takakura, but he definitely was not the Ken Takakura she was looking for. I honestly never even heard of him before reading this manga, and I had no reason to. But after looking him up, he's actually one of the more accomplished actors in Japan's history, and he looked pretty damn handsome when he was younger, so while her obsession with him is pretty random, I get it. And then we're quickly introduced to Okarun, a nerdy looking boy who is all about aliens due to this lack of friendships that he has. He has this whole panel where he goes off about the Illuminati working with reptilian humanoids, Obama going to Mars, the Loch Ness Monster. I wrote in my notes if any of these things will potentially be plot points later in the series. Maybe not Obama, but like the other things. And after reading more of the series, it's actually really cool to see Loch Ness Monster or Nessie show up later in the series. But that's a conversation for when we get to that arc in this later. For now, Okarun gets into his Momo regarding spirits versus aliens, and this is pretty much what prompts the entire situation of the first chapter, as the two attempt to prove the other wrong just to be proven wrong themselves, as Momo faces down aliens while Okarun faces down the one and only Turbo Granny. The first chapter of this series feels like an overall pilot episode of what's to come. If you don't like what's happening in the first chapter, you probably won't like DanDaDan. This is just gonna end up being more crazy, more insane, more wild, just more of what happens in the first chapter just keeps happening throughout the rest of the series. So if you don't like this, you don't like DanDaDan. And if you do like it, you're in for a good time. The highlight of this chapter for me was when Momo stumbled upon the aliens at the abandoned hospital. Like, this artwork is so insane, and the way they chase after her until eventually ripping off all of her clothes, that's so terrifying. I know this technically counts as fan service, especially with the way she shows up in just her underwear moments later, but nothing about this feels sexy. Especially when she's about to receive this big robot alien package inside of her against her will, when suddenly Okarun pops in the most wild, possessed transformation I've ever seen. Momo awakening her spiritual powers is also a huge highlight and a big hook for me. Gave me big Mob Psycho energy in all the right ways. We end this first chapter with a really great special character interaction between Okarun and Momo that I haven't seen in a shonen manga in quite some time. Okarun is an actual gentleman who is even asking for Momo to put her clothes on, a direct contrast to the asshole presented in the beginning of the manga. She fights someone who only wants to see her naked, while she protects someone who wants to keep her modest. I love this parallel, especially when you notice it with the two kicks Momo does in this first chapter that I honestly didn't even notice until the trailer for the anime came out, how similar they were. The big revelation at the end of this chapter is also, well, Okarun's real name, which just so happens to be the same as Momo's favorite actor, Ken Takakura, but she elects to ignore this information. I love it. Everything about this chapter, chef's kiss. Turbo Granny is also pretty unsettling to look at, and while her schlong comments are actually really funny, it's still pretty terrifying in the grand scheme of things. But let's take this opportunity to look deeper into Turbo Granny. I felt like I instantly recognized this character the moment she was introduced, and fans of Mob Psycho 100 might know why. It's interesting that this is the second time I brought up Mob Psycho 100, and perhaps I can get into further detail later about the similarities between the two series, since DanDaDan kind of reminds me of Mob Psycho 100, but more amped up, more crazy. But again, I'll save that for later. The reason why Turbo Granny makes an appearance in both series is pretty much because she's based on a real world phenomenon in Japan. Turbo Bachan, which pretty much translates to Turbo Granny, is an urban legend originating around the highways of Mount Roko in the Hyogo Prefecture in Japan. The story typically involves someone noticing a running old lady in the rearview mirror while driving late at night. DanDaDan decided to take that story and add upon it, making Turbo Granny a protector of the spirits of girls who died tragically. And while the manga never really said this outright, I got the impression that these girls lost their lives due to an unfortunate incident of SA from men. Hence why Turbo Granny immediately attacked Okarun when he showed up, and went for his schlong of all things. Chapter 2 is probably my favorite chapter of this entire arc, but not a lot actually happens that's relevant to the story itself. The chapter basically shows off a giant fight between the team of both Momo and Okarun versus a giant sumo wrestling alien known as the Flatwoods Monster. Now, the Flatwoods Monster is also based on a real urban legend as well, but it looks literally nothing like the urban legend. Now, while this chapter may not have progressed the overall story too much, it did do some pretty noteworthy things. It's just a really great self-contained story right here. The fan service was toned down compared to the first chapter. We got our first sign of nosebleeds indicating the presence of a spirit. There's this level of dread that creeps up when Momo said that she never heard of that specific doorbell. Tatsu's ability to create suspense in the manga is near unparalleled. The only thing that comes close to this level of suspense that we feel right here in this chapter was when Naruto opened the door and saw Itachi. Like, in the early Naruto, like pre-Shippuden, like that was the only thing that comes close to what I was feeling here. Yet, that moment in Naruto happened around what, chapter 130, 140, 150? This is chapter 2 of DanDaDan, and I'm already feeling suspense. Like, that's crazy what Tatsu's able to do. We also see that the mangaka approaches fights with big bad enemies when the main character is underdeveloped. It's for them to think smarter, not harder when it comes to solutions. I mean, we see it here with the clever means that Momo uses to defeat the Flatwoods monster. But my favorite takeaway from this chapter is Momo calling out Okarun, the boy who has no friends because he keeps distancing himself away from people after making assumptions about them. This is essentially his entire character arc throughout the entire series and the primary challenge for himself. There's just too much to love about this chapter. My only problem, if I had to nitpick it, is even after rereading it, I'm still not sure what the point of the alien being here really is, but whatever, I don't care. Now, the following chapter introduces Seiko, Momo's grandma, and it makes such an interesting choice of initially showing her off as this really incompetent psychic reader who is getting everything wrong when guessing facts about a celebrity. Now, while it isn't long, I just love that the mangaka decides to reveal that Seiko is actually correct about everything that she said in a later chapter. It shows he isn't afraid to play a longer game when it comes to the narrative, and I'm really here for it. Seiko stops a Turbo Granny possessed Okarun from inspecting more of Momo's body. Like, geez, this is a weirdly reoccurring scenario for this volume that I hope stops. Eventually, somehow, like, stop inspecting her body, bro. But this is the start of the build-up for the inevitable Turbo Granny clash. As while things take a little bit of a lighthearted tone right here, the following chapter does a complete 180 as Turbo Granny takes over Okarun's body as he's taking a dump. What is this series, bro? And threatens that if they don't meet that night, she's gonna go on a killing spree. And just like that, Momo and Okarun have no time to train. It's go time right then and there. It's extremely intense, and I don't envy the situation that Momo and Okarun find themselves in. Sort of reminiscent of the Land of Waves arc a little bit, where our heroes are just thrown right into the midst of things and they need to act even if they don't have the proper training for it. Seiko and Momo are initially shown to have this really harsh relationship with each other, yet the reasons why I love their dynamics so much is shown pretty quick. One is when Momo owns up to her mistake of disbelieving spirits. You see, she grew up thinking that spirits weren't real. She only really believed in spirits just because her grandma did, but not really because she herself believed in them. So she bends down to apologize to her out of respect for her. And another is when Seiko rushes to give Momo a hug before she heads off to fight Turbo Granny, begging for her not to be killed. It was actually really sentimental, and it goes a long way to show that while they bicker with one another, their relationship is ultimately one of deep respect, of deep love for each other at the end of the day. Also, maybe this will get revealed eventually, but where I'm at right now, I do wonder what happened to Momo's parents. Hold on, did they ever talk about that? Am I crazy? I don't remember her talking about what happened to her parents ever. Yeah, I just literally looked through. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't remember her mentioning her parents ever. But she did used to get bullied for believing in spirits when she was a kid. And I just love that the bully plays a big role later in the series. But that's a tease for later. The rest of the arc is the epic climax with Okarun and Momo facing down Turbo Granny, which leads them initially from the tunnel Okarun first encountered her to eventually the rest of Shono City as Turbo Granny fuses with a bound crab spirit of all things. I sound repetitive, I'm sure, but once again, the art is crazy here. Consistently gorgeous, consistently phenomenal through and through, and incredibly epic as we go from set piece to set piece, with the two having to think of consistently creative ways to defeat their enemies. Well, more so Momo than Okarun. Time and time again, Momo showcases her intellect when it comes to these opponents, and this is practically the primary reason why I adore her so much compared to any other shonen MC right now. While other MCs will choose to get stronger, which of course is always valid when it comes to fighting tougher opponents, Momo always, so far, has to think out of the box. This style of creativity was first demonstrated when fighting that giant Flatwoods monster sumo wrestler from earlier, as she used a yokai charm and the sumo wrestler's own offense against him to defeat him. And here, knowing that crabs become stiff when exposed to hot water, she brings the Turbo Granny crab monster to a hot springs where she pours the steaming hot water on it. Now, it doesn't really work here, but I'm just so crazy and in love with this outside the box thinking that she's already displaying so early on in the manga. And once again, she displays it when hopping on the train as she calculates how fast the train goes versus how fast Turbo Granny can go. Now, while she may not have completely accounted for the stops that the train needs to make, it didn't matter. Turbo Granny fell right into the trap that Seiko laid out for her, giving our heroes the win. And after a successful celebration, eating some dinner at Grandma's place, the chapter ends so cute, with Momo waiting for Okarun at school the next day. Okarun finally has a friend, and Momo ends up with a real Ten Takakura, as opposed to someone who just looks like him. What a great parallel. And honestly, what a great development from where we started. In just 8 chapters, a whole story is told. A huge big bad enemy defeated, 2 characters that I instantly fall in love with, already in a much better place than where they were in the first chapter. I mean, this is the foundation of DanDaDan right here. It's all these 2 characters, Momo and Okarun, and I love it. Like, insanely funny, insanely scary, great art, fantastic characters so far. Like, what is there not to love about DanDaDan? I adore this series, and while the Turbo Granny arc is relatively short, just 8 chapters, I hope you can see where there was a lot for me to talk about. And yet, I still feel like I missed a lot of stuff to mention and bring up when it comes to this introductory arc. While the Turbo Granny arc did a great job showing some great art, some great powers, some very scary moments, and yet have very funny moments, I just ultimately come back to DanDaDan for these 2 right here, Momo and Okarun. It all started and ended with them, and I for one can't wait to see how this keeps developing and growing. Will those aliens in the beginning, the Serpoians, make a return eventually? Will Okarun and Momo get together eventually? Who else will end up getting powers like Okarun? I can't wait to learn more as I continue onwards. Thanks so much for breaking down the Turbo Granny arc with me, and join me next time as we get into the one and only acrobatic silky arc. Felt weird to say out loud. Acrobatic silky.